Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. On behalf of the Yale Club of Argentina and the Centro Argentino de Ingenieros, I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this motivating talk on sustainability and energy transition, the new global agenda. Today, we have a very important, prominent guest, Professor Daniel Esty. Professor Esty is the Hill House Professor of Yale University with primary appointments at Yale School of the Environment and the Law School, with a secondary appointment at the Yale School of Management. He also serves as director of the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy and as a director of the Yale Initiative on Sustainable Finance. Professor Esty is the author or editor of 14 books, including the prize-winning Guide to Corporate Sustainability, Green to Gold, and dozens of articles on environmental and energy policy. Today, Professor Esty, we'll exchange ideas with our local prominent figure, Pablo Bereciartúa, current president of the Centro Argentino de Ingenieros and a Yale fellow. This talk was organized by the Centro Argentino de Ingenieros, the Yale Club of Argentina, and with the support of the Yale International Alliance. The talk will last around 40, 45, 50 minutes, and then we will kindly ask you to post the questions you may have in the chat so we can address them at the end. This will let us have a better organization. Now, I will leave you with Ingeniero Pablo Bereciartúa.
Thank you, Guillermina. It is for me a real pleasure to be holding this event at the Argentinian Engineering Center with Daniel Esty. I want to say before that Guillermina Rosencrantz is also a graduate from Yale, and she is the president of the Yale Argentinian chapter, a very active and influential group in our country with quite a few of interesting people and ideas that typically improve a lot our policies and also generate opportunities for our society. So with these few words, I'd like to start our event with Professor Daniel Esty by making an announcement, because as he has known very recently, our Argentinian Engineering Center, which is the main institution in Argentina for engineering, and it is a 125-year-old institution, has a very unique category to distinguish people that, according to our bylaw, are significant people in science, in engineering, and in other relevant activities and fields that become public figures, and they have a distinguished trajectory in their country or abroad because of their knowledge and their outstanding contribution for the humanity, their country, or the profession. And it is a lifelong designation that is typically decided without any proposal from the distinguished person and without the need for any special presentation. It is the board of our institution that from time to time identify significant people and distinguish them with the degree, with the title of honorary fellow of our institution. So it is for me, Dan, a real pleasure to start our talk by announcing this title that our institution is offering and conferring to you as an honorary fellow of the Argentinian Engineer Center.
Pablo, thank you very much. Muchas gracias. It's a wonderful way to start the program. I'm deeply honored to have this opportunity to be an honorary fellow of your society. and very much appreciate the gesture of support and of confirming of the agenda that I've been working on and the connection it has to the work that all of you do.
Thank you so much. It is a real honor for us, as I mentioned. So let me go into our talk, and I have several topics, Daniel, that I would like to cover with you. And basically, this is a conversation to know what you think on some of these big issues, and also to have a view from your mind on what is going on around these topics. So the very first one that I would like to mention to you and ask you, where are we standing at, is sustainability. So this is a big word, and all of us for several decades, I think, are working and thinking about what that really means. So let me turn that question to you. What is sustainability about?
You know, it's a very good question. And I think the honest truth is there are different views of what sustainability is about, and certainly different priorities that people might have. But from my point of view, sustainability is the sort of step above our past focus on environmental protection to a recognition that we need to think about environment and related topics in terms of success, not just in the short run, but over time. So when I think of sustainability, I'm really thinking about several dimensions, that we are integrating our environmental, social, and economic strategies in a way that delivers a broad base of success for a society, in doing so again with an eye towards long-term results. And this, of course, means addressing issues that are front of mind, like climate change and the need to move to a clean energy future. But it also means addressing water issues, waste issues, and a whole set of social concerns that are now really coming into sharp focus, including structural inequality, the need for racial justice, questions about diversity, particularly in the workplace, all of which are part of this more broad-based view of what a sustainable future needs to look like. And for those who are interested, and Pablo, I know you know this, I have led an effort at Yale over the last several years to try to set an agenda for what a sustainable future might require, with a special focus on the environmental dimensions, because that's what I study. And of course, I'm teaching in the Yale Law School, which is the building right behind me in the background of my shot here, but also the Yale School of the Environment, as well as the Yale School of Management. And the Yale School of Environment this past year and a half has been organizing something called the Yale Environmental Dialogue, aimed, Pablo, just at your question of what is a sustainable future require. And we have engaged scholars across the campus and around the country, and frankly, around the world in some cases, to help us identify critical elements of the sustainable future we're trying to build. So for those who are interested, I have a new book that's come out just last year called A Better Future, 40 Big Ideas for a Sustainable Future. So for those who are interested, this book would really give you a menu of elements of what sustainability needs to look like in the years ahead. Again, beginning with big issues that everyone knows well, like climate change, but going on to address a whole series of other concerns around water and waste and materials, including some things that might be of interest to the engineers in the audience. A focus, for example, on not just planetary boundaries and how to create a circular economy, but really focused on materials and wondering about the boundaries of how we use various materials that are part of our natural resource endowment on the planet. So lots of different ideas. It's an edited volume, 50 different authors contributing these 40 different essays. So something of a useful survey for those who are interested.
Great. And let me tell everybody that is with us in this event right now that we will be posting information regarding this book and other books, plus several links regarding what Professor Daniel Esty will be mentioning in the talk and some of the work he's been doing recently. So you will find that in our chat. And also let me remind everybody that if you have questions or comments, you can place them in the chat and we will be covering them at the end of our conversation. So let me come back to the topic and ask you, Daniel, whether you believe that we are in a turning point. So for several decades, I think the concepts that you were mentioning were shaping in a way, and a lot of people that were not believing in them somehow, they were turning their minds, and there are new generations also. You are right with your picture of Yale behind you, and I'm sure you have a very clear exposure to the new generations and the new way that people are thinking, and the new way people are willing to live, so to say, where the values are. So my question to you is, are we, as some people believe, in a turning point where sustainability is going to become mainstream, and where we will see changes in economic, and also we will see private sector becoming somehow of a leading role for sustainability in any place and in different countries? Is that real?
Well, I certainly believe we are at a turning point, and I think the momentum is really building behind a commitment to a sustainable future broadly and to action on climate change in particular. And Pablo, you're quite right that the younger generation, the folks who are my students at Yale, are really very committed to this change. And if anything, a little bit angry at some of us who are the older generation for having been slow to make progress on some of the issues they consider to be so important. And I think we all know the Swedish activist Greta Thunberg, but she is kind of the example of that younger generation. She's a particularly hard-charging and motivated spokesperson for that generation, sometimes quite angry about the lack of progress or the slow pace of progress. But I do think we're seeing the change. We're seeing it in a variety of ways. You know, the world community has obviously been distracted in a fundamental way over the past year by the COVID-19 pandemic. But what is interesting is as we begin to see the light at the end of the pandemic tunnel, and I can report from the United States that enormous progress is being made on vaccination. I know it's been slower in some other places, but in the United States now, we really are seeing the potential for turning a corner on the pandemic. In the state of Connecticut, we now have just announced that more than half of the adult population is vaccinated. And so that's very significant as you move to really suppress the virus. But I raise this not because we're discussing the virus today, but because what's fascinating to see is that you might have imagined that sustainability would be pushed aside because of the urgent public health crisis and the related economic distress that so many people are in. But it's not true. In fact, there's been a very big focus, and this is part of President Biden's new sort of priority package to build back better. Again, a good spirit for the engineers. We know that we need to remake our economies. And in a number of places around the world, this idea that we're going to build back better has taken root. Prince Charles has been using that phrase in Britain. The World Economic Forum has a whole project about build back better. And fundamentally, it is the idea that we are not going to just relaunch the economy without attention to longer term consequences. So sustainability is going to be embedded in these strategies. And you certainly see it in the United States. President Biden, as I think you all probably know, put through a big COVID relief package that really had embedded within it a number of sustainability elements. And even more, he's now put forward a major economic stimulus and infrastructure program. And that infrastructure program is in large measure designed to build a society that will be more sustainable, will be better prepared to respond to climate change, will move the base of the energy system away from fossil fuels to renewable power, and really committing a lot of resources to building the transmission lines to get that clean electricity from where it's being produced with offshore wind and solar arrays in the desert to the load centers, to the cities. And so I think you do see a commitment that's really emerged in the United States. And by the way, I see this, matched in many places around the world. And I think the global community, as some of you will know, is preparing to gather at the end of the year in the United Kingdom in Glasgow for what's known as the Conference of the Parties. And of course, that's the parties to the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change. And each year, the countries that have signed on to that climate change treaty come together to negotiate further developments of their agenda, further commitments to global climate change action. Last year's meeting that was meant to be in Glasgow in December had to be postponed, but it will be in November this year in Glasgow. And again, the British government is hosting it with a hope and expectation that countries all around the world will up their commitments, up the ante, as we say, in a gambling mode, and really do more in the way of ambition to signal the change that, Pablo, you've asked about, this kind of turning point toward a sustainable future, and in that case in particular, towards a clean energy future. So I think signs of the change are everywhere. You asked as well about the private sector, and that's a particular focus of my own research. I've done a number of books over the last decade on corporate sustainability. By the way, the first book ever done on corporate sustainability in Latin America, which came out just 2 years ago, called The Labyrinth of Sustainability. I might even have a copy of it here. I can't help but just show this off for a moment because it is the first book on sustainability in Latin America. And again, the subtitle is Green Business Lessons from Latin American Corporate Leaders. And what I am highlighting is that the corporate world is now taking sustainability very seriously. It is not waiting for government to tell everybody what to do. And this is true not just in Europe, where people might expect it, or in the United States, where maybe a little less expected, but there are still corporate leaders. It's now happening all across Latin America as well. So I do think the spirit of a watershed moment, of there being no going back to the old ways, is quite clear, and that we are headed very much for a sustainable future, led in part by governments, but in part by activists like Greta Thunberg, but also by corporate leaders who've decided that they want to make sure their companies are contributing to a sustainable society, and even ahead of regulation, are stepping up to that challenge.
Yeah, and I think that was basically one of the points that I wanted to hear from you is exactly how is the debate in the US, because we are following the new package and also the what we see as hard discussions at the Congress level on what actually will be the final shape of that package. But everybody is mentioning that it's going to be historical, that the size of it is going to be very big, and that the goals that are set really high. So what is the role that you see for innovation and technology innovation within that picture? Because if you can get a little bit into some further details of the ideas that are being discussed in the US, what you can see is that there are both traditional infrastructure projects and recovering and building back, and there is a lot of innovation around how to do it with new technologies. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So first of all, as you know, the world looks very different with President Biden in the White House compared to President Trump. And I think this has given the American people a sense that we are in the midst of a change. We're going in a new direction. But there is still political complexity. We're a very divided country, and it remains the case that the Democrats, who control both the House and the Senate, as well as the White House, have only a very slim majority in the House of Representatives, and the Senate is actually split 50-50. And the only way the Democrats have control is that the vice president is allowed to vote when there is a tie. So in that case, the Democrats do have at least a slim controlling majority. And I think what you see is a game plan emerging that will be quite innovative in a number of regards. And I think what's interesting is that the push for innovation goes beyond technology development. It's not simply new wind turbines or better solar arrays. It's also what I call the supporting technology. So a smart grid, smart appliances, smart homes. a real recognition you have to reinforce the big breakthroughs with a structure and a system that brings them into broad use. So there is a lot of innovation in that regard, but also innovation in the kind of incentives that are put in front of the business community to encourage every kind of corporation to remake their business model, to be more energy efficient, to move towards renewable power, and frankly, to avoid pollution. I think we're moving quite quickly toward what I call an end to externalities. And I think we're seeing a change in the spirit of the public, and this is not just in the United States, but the fundamentals of capitalism are being debated and refined all over the world. And I think the fundamental change that's coming is going to be that it's no longer acceptable for a company to gain privately at public expense, by which I mean you can't have a business model that sends smoke up a smokestack or effluent out a pipe into the nearby river or greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, where the company will benefit privately by being more profitable, but society pays a price, either with local air pollution, contaminated water, or the buildup of greenhouse gases that threaten to cause climate change. So I think you see, not that all pollution is going to end, but this end to externalities really means an end to externalities, pollution and other things that are not paid for. So we're going to end up with new regulatory controls that mean that any bit of harm that a company is causing, any element of emissions, is going to be both required to be reduced, and ultimately whatever residual harm is present will be paid for. So we should expect pollution charges. And so that's innovation, by the way, in policy, innovation in incentives. I think there's also innovation in how the public is being engaged. One of the things the Biden administration is doing very aggressively is reaching out to the public and making sure that they are part of this strategy of moving to a sustainable future, with a big push on university campuses to have a sustainable campus, to have every school be teaching sustainability. And really every community is now being part of this conversation. So innovation is at the heart of this change. And I think you're starting to really see it connect with broad parts of the public. And I think the political support for President Biden's game plan is rising. And frankly, he's got a high favorability rating, probably because he's done very well on addressing the COVID-19 problem. But it's spilling over into support for his agenda on the economic strategy and on this innovation strategy towards a sustainable future.
And regarding those opinions, let me get you to some. I mean, if you look at some of the private sector leaders or companies like Tesla, for example, and the value of the company, which is unbelievable comparing with more traditional companies building the same, and some forecasts that are saying that in 10 years, maybe 50% of the cars are going to be electric cars in places like the US. And also going to people like Bill Gates and his recent book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, where he talks about the green premium, and which is a way of, so to say, getting the externalities into the market, into the prices. Exactly. And then making them a part of the decision making of the whole society, so to say. So let me back again to you on whether you believe that we will see an acceleration of the private sector leading this. Because for a long time, you have the activists, the NGOs, and a lot of people making conscience that the change was a necessity. But now we may be starting to see that even some private sector leaders are trying to say this is the way, this is a new way to solve the issue according to the current and the future values. So do you see that happening and accelerating in the next month, and also as a reality of the post-pandemia, so to say?
I think the corporate world is changing very quickly. I think, I've been writing that it makes sense from a company point of view to bring a focus on originally environment and then energy, but now broadly sustainability into core business strategy. And I think smart companies are doing that. That's in fact what I first argued in my big book on corporate sustainability a decade ago called Green to Gold. And the theory of that book was, and this is the subtitle, so you don't have to read the book because you'll have the whole story, but it's how smart companies use environmental strategy to innovate, create value, and build competitive advantage. And I think what companies are finding is that if they run out in front of the pack, ahead of regulation, but really innovate in ways that solve sustainability problems, their customers are appreciative, and the public is appreciative, and government is less likely to want to regulate them tightly. And so the corporate world is being driven by a number of things to become more sustainable. And customers are first and foremost. If you can solve your customers' energy issues or environment issues or sustainability concerns, you have really got a strong place with that customer. But it's also the case that society is asking businesses to do more, and companies are saying, yes, we can be part of the solution here. And another point of pressure, another place to look in terms of why suddenly companies are trying to be sustainable is the investor community. Now, this is, of course, particularly true of larger companies where there is a stock market that is where the owners of that company exist. But it also, I think, reflects a broader trend. And this, by the way, is another of the books that I wanted to just make mention of. I think it's now in the chat, called Values at Work. And the subtitle is Sustainable Investing and ESG Reporting. And again, for those who aren't following this closely, the ESG acronym stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance Performance Issues that companies are increasingly being asked to report on. And there are growing numbers of investors and investment advisors who are studying corporate ESG performance and making their decisions about which stocks to hold, which companies to invest in, based in part on the sustainability leadership or lack thereof of a company. And so you're seeing a number of investors saying, I want better alignment between my values and my portfolio. I want my money to be in companies or projects or industries that are helping us get to a sustainable future and not in ones that are not. So there's companies, there's investors now pulling money out of things like fossil fuels, polluting industry, and putting them into renewable electricity generation, water cleanup technologies, and other elements of the sustainable future. So I think if customers are the number one driver for companies beginning to focus on sustainability, number two, especially for big companies, will be investors. And of course, the government is always there as a third force. So all of this is starting to mount real pressure. And I think the kind of young people becoming a bigger part of the consuming base, more of the customers, ever more in government, and the young people becoming investors as they succeed in their own careers makes these trends likely to accelerate in the years ahead. So that I do think, going back to your original question, we're at a turning point. There's no going back to the dirty old future of the past. It's only a question of how far and how fast we move on this trend towards a sustainable future.
Great. Let me take you to the global level. So what is your view on how this agenda is moving on in Europe and in Asia, mainly in China?
So you've got sort of two opposite ends of the spectrum with Europe and Asia. In Europe, you've got some of the real sustainability leading companies and countries. I do at Yale every other year, a team produces something called the Environmental Performance Index. And that's a scorecard at the country level of how nations are addressing a dozen different dimensions of the sustainability challenge, reflecting both environmental public health and issues like air and water pollution and climate change, but also ecosystem vitality. Are we protecting our land and our water as habitat? And the truth of the matter is, we see a certain number of countries that really come out on top, and most of them are in Northern Europe. Number one in our ranking of 2020 was Denmark. And I think you do see kind of a foreshadowing of the future in places like Denmark, with a very significant commitment to clean energy. They've already moved substantially towards replacing fossil fuels with, in the case of Denmark, a lot of wind power. And what is also signaled is that these are growing areas of the economy. So some of the biggest wind power companies are actually the Danish companies that are now building projects, not just off Copenhagen, but off the coast of New England, where I live. They have actually won a number of the offshore lease rights to build the wind turbines that will be the power of tomorrow. And so I think there are a number of companies and countries, particularly in Europe, Northern Europe especially, who are out in front of this trend. I would say a little bit the opposite in Asia. You've got still a huge focus in China in particular, but India as well, and other parts of Asia in between, on economic growth, on poverty alleviation. But it is starting to move towards a greater commitment to sustainability. By the way, on my scorecard, China, 3 iterations ago, so 6 years ago, was solidly in the bottom tier of our ranking. But on the most recent ranking, they moved to the middle tier, literally up to about 120th place out of 180 in the ranking. So that's a very substantial improvement over the past decade, reflecting China's serious response to their own pollution problems and a recognition, again, partly driven by economic opportunity, that the world is changing. And China is very eager to sell the technologies of tomorrow. They have produced an enormous amount of progress in lowering the cost of solar arrays and solar power, better wind turbines and cost-effective wind power. They're doing a lot of work on electric vehicles and on battery technology. So China's really positioning itself to be a leader in the build out of the industries for a sustainable future. But they remain with significant challenges at home. A good bit of the electricity of China is still today from coal-fired power plants and is very dirty. The cities remain quite polluted. Although, to be honest, our data show that India now is home to 9 of the 10 most air-polluted cities in the world. And this is a complete change. Again, 10 years ago, it was China, numbers 1 to 10 on the bad list there. Today, it's a 9 out of 10 in India. And I think Kathmandu, Nepal next door is the other one. So it's a very dirty part of the world with lots to be done still in Asia to catch up. But I think there is a growing sense that the world has changed, again, that we've hit a turning point, there's no going back, and that Asia has to catch up at some point too.
Now let's go a little bit to a country like Argentina, not in any specific details, but this change in agenda, what is happening right now, may be an opportunity for several countries to update their views and also to update their infrastructure, which in many cases is old and it is not maintained. And in other cases, it is not even there. So you can start from scratch with new ideas and to try to get into a new paradigm. At the same time, it may be in the next big global meetings like Glasgow that the adaptation agenda and the financing of the adaptation for countries will be a significant part of the discussion. So how do you promote economic recovery and also provide financing for the new policies aligned with climate change across the world? So what do you think about that? Is it a realistic view to think that a country like Argentina can take this turning point as an opportunity?
Well, I think Argentina is well positioned to take it as an opportunity, and others are taking it as an opportunity. And I think it's one of the reasons that China has continued to be engaged on climate change and on these other sustainability issues. In fact, we've talked already about the COP26 to be held in Glasgow later in the year. There are 2 other big meetings this year of the global community that relate to the sustainability agenda. One is a meeting of the conference or the Convention on Biological Diversity, and China is hosting that meeting. The other big meeting, by the way, is on the world food system. And the real center of that conversation is going to be on the sustainability and security of the food system. And so I think what you're seeing is that there are a set of issues on which a country like Argentina could be a major player. Argentina is actually quite strong on biological diversity, but does need resources to invest more. Argentina, obviously a major contributor in terms of food supply and food security to the world. And again, if Argentina were to say, we are going to go into this, not just this meeting this year, but into the next decade, committed to being the leaders of creating a sustainable food future, sustainable agriculture, it would be a signal to the world of something important. And then I think with regard to industry, many countries, China being the best example, have decided that they are going to use the current moment, the need for greater action on climate change, a commitment to sustainability, to both remake their existing infrastructure and build out new infrastructure, often necessary because they don't have enough, on a quite different basis from what they were doing in the past. And that too seems like a strategy Argentina could pick up. Argentina obviously needs to modernize infrastructure. One of the reasons that China has, in fact, adopted these sustainability goals, people keep saying, why would China commit to climate change goals when it's got so many dirty power plants? And the answer is they want to move. And frankly, even ahead of shifting their power plants, they're using the fact they've signed on to greenhouse gas emissions control targets as a political point of leverage for shutting down dirty old state-owned enterprises, shutting down the most polluting of their steel mills and other dirty factories that they really don't want to run anymore. Because it turns out the old infrastructure is not just highly polluting, it's actually pretty inefficient. It only makes money because the capital is already fully deployed and it's been depreciated. There's no capital cost. But eventually countries recognize, and I think Argentina's there alongside China in many ways, that the future requires investment, building the new infrastructure, and kind of setting the foundation for an economic vitality going forward that depends on having world-leading technology and cutting-edge infrastructure so that the businesses that build on that infrastructure can themselves be competitive in global markets.
Now, in this multipolar world that we are starting to live in, a little bit more than it used to be 10 years ago, so to say, how do you see the US in relation to the foreign policy? So some of this agenda, for example, for the Americas, where Argentina is placed, will become more significant. This is to say, do you see the US in this administration fostering some of this agenda as a possibility for exchanging commerce, for exchanging some policy decisions that will be win-win for the relationship between the countries? Do you see that as a possibility in the view of the White House or not?
Well, let me pause here, Pablo, and just say I can't help but mention with the Yale Club being a sponsor of this event, and I am grateful to the Yale Club folks who organized this. But there are a number of Yale graduates who are driving the very agenda you're talking about. John Kerry, of course, is President Biden's climate change special envoy. And one of the things, actually two things he's been mentioning go right to your question. John Kerry has been talking a lot about finance. And I think one of the things all of us who've been working on these issues have come to realize is that the 20th century model of how we address climate change in particular, but sustainability more broadly, had a flaw in it. We did not pay attention to where the money would come from to do the work we needed to do to build a clean energy infrastructure or a broader sustainable future. And so there's now a great deal of focus on finance. And I do think it's going to take a mix of resources. To the extent in the past there was thought about it, it was all around overseas development assistance or ODA. But that is very much a 20th century view, and it was never enough money and couldn't possibly be enough money. In fact, as some people on this call might know, there is a green climate fund that was set up to the side of the climate change treaty, hosted, by the way, by the South Koreans, with a hope that they could gather the funds necessary to fund the transition, particularly in the developing world, towards a clean energy future. But that entire effort, now 10 years long, has raised only a little bit more than $10 billion. And the need is about 100 billion per year. And by the way, of that 10 billion, a significant amount of it was in multi-year pledges. 3 billion of it was a pledge from the Obama administration that the Trump team never paid on. So the money in that fund is tiny compared to the scope required. So the real goal here is, again, innovation in finance. And one of the things I see emerging is a whole set of creative ideas about how to engage private capital leveraged by public resources to reduce risk of flowing money to the build out of infrastructure, clean energy infrastructure, sustainability infrastructure. And that's what I did while I was away from Yale for 3 years, a few years back, running Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. We set up what has become known as the Connecticut Green Bank, and using limited public money to leverage private capital, reduce the risk for private money going into these projects, we were able to get a 7-fold increase in the build out of clean energy projects. Because it turns out if you can lower the interest rate on those projects from 12% to 5%, suddenly lots of people want to participate. The banks are very excited to put up the money. Suddenly the risk they perceived in these projects goes away, and you're able to get a lot done. So I do think innovation in finance is one of the most important areas. Green banks, green bonds, public-private partnerships, all part of that package. And again, this is being talked about at the highest levels in the United States. One of the other points that's interesting about the Biden administration is not only do you have John Kerry, again, Yale graduate, on this issue, but the folks in several other critical positions have the same sensitivity to this need to address sustainability. The head of the very important White House National Economic Council is a guy named Brian Deese, who was a student of mine at the Yale Law School just a few years ago, now in this very important role. Also heading the National Security Council, Jake Sullivan, another Yale graduate, another student of mine. So we've got these Yale folks in critical places across the administration, and in jobs where a sensitivity to sustainability might not have traditionally been part of the job description. We didn't think of National Security Council requiring that, but that's very much something Jake Sullivan brings to the role. Brian Deese, in fact, closed out the Obama administration as President Obama's climate change advisor. So this is a transformed world where these issues that were once second tier or secondary are now very much primary. And we're seeing that, by the way, in places you never would imagine it. Janet Yellen, who's the Treasury Secretary in the United States, got the job over several other strong contenders because she actually had a deep sense of what had to be done on the finance side for climate change. And so when she interviewed with Biden, it was not her knowledge of the Treasury kind of baseline issues. It was her ability to do all those baseline things and bring a climate change commitment to the Treasury Department's agenda that got her the position. So I think we're seeing a big change, a real push, and frankly, a Biden administration that is very much in a mode of redefining America's place in the world. It's in a competition now with China. It's in a very difficult place with regard to Russia, but it wants to work closely with longtime allies, particularly across the Americas, to ensure that we're thinking together about how to create a sustainable future and working together. And I think you'll see the Biden administration try to provide support wherever it can to reinforce that commitment and to partner with not just Argentina, but countries all across the hemisphere.
I think this is a very positive message, and it's a very positive change that will have very strong consequences. So I'm very glad to hear that your view is in that sense as well. I have two more broad issues for you to have some comments on, and then we will turn into some questions of the people before we finish. So the first one is regarding education. So, you are a very distinguished professor at Yale. Many friends of mine believe that you are their best professor at Yale. So given your experience and the uniqueness of Yale in many senses, where do you see are 2 or 3 of the challenges for education, university level education, in the next few years?
So I will give you one that's kind of an academic insider view and another that's more broad-based. From the academic insider, and this will be relevant to people that are in the university community in Argentina, I think education is going to have to shift from what has been the kind of priority and focus of the past to a new 21st century model. And I would say, I'm going to caricature a little bit, but the 20th century, by the way, this is not just the 20th century, but the model of the last 500 years was to encourage deep knowledge search in very narrow veins. So digging deep on a particular topic. And I think that's the model of the natural sciences. You try to get people who can really break new ground by going deep, deep, deep. I think knowledge in the 21st century requires breadth. It requires synthesizing, pulling together ideas from different places, different spaces, different disciplines, and creating new integrated knowledge models that's very different than that old path going back to, frankly, to the Enlightenment 500 years ago of trying to dig deep in a particular niche of science. And I also think we have new tools available that people have just begun to deploy in the academic setting. The internet, big data, the ability to analyze in new and different ways. We've gotten some of that going, but there's a lot of work to do. And it may well mean that we change how we learn as well as how we do research. But I think that is coming. Now, I would also tell you that, and this is the more popular piece of the answer, that universities are now very high profile institutions and have to themselves model good behavior. And that includes good sustainability behavior. So we are seeing Yale scrambling now to develop a sustainability strategy that keeps up with what the Biden administration says it wants the country to do. Again, for those who are not following the details, President Biden hosted a summit meeting just 2 weeks ago, virtual summit, of course, but with leaders from around the world focused on how to ramp up global ambition on the way to this big meeting in Glasgow at the end of the year. And the conversation quickly turned to what I think is now the consensus that we need deep decarbonization, that's the term of art, by 2050. And that effectively means net zero greenhouse gas emissions in the next 30 years. And I think that agenda of really transforming the energy foundations of our society from fossil fuels to clean energy in 3 decades is a big challenge. But what is fascinating is to see how that deep decarbonization strategy, and by the way, for anyone who's interested, I've been part of a team of almost 100 scholars and researchers across America that developed a deep decarbonization strategy for the United States. We call it the Zero Carbon Action Plan. And you may have the link to post in the chat as well of this ZCAP. And what it does is lay out sector by sector what is required for society to move from where we are now to this clean energy future, looking at critical areas like power generation, transportation, buildings, industry, food and agriculture, and materials. Again, by the way, issues that will be of great interest to the engineers out there. And this ZCAP strategy spells out the pathways in those critical sectors. And what I think is fascinating now is how that agenda is cascading from a political conversation to being a sort of action obligation for every company, especially big companies, and now every university. So I've seen over just the last few weeks, Yale suddenly very eager to figure out what its zero carbon strategy to get to 2050 with net zero emissions is going to look like. We have a big power plant on the campus, which they were very pleased to convert just a few years ago from coal to natural gas. But it now looks like the days of natural gas are limited. And this, by the way, responds to one of the questions in the chat. I do think natural gas is a transition fuel. It's cleaner than burning coal, cleaner than burning oil. So for anyone who can make a transition from those dirtier fuels to natural gas, it buys you a decade or two. But 30 years from now, I don't think we're burning natural gas, or at least not very much. It may well be that it's the reserve power source, or what we say in the industry is the peak load response will be natural gas power. But otherwise, the base load is going to be cleaner burning or cleaner fuels, cleaner sources, wind power, solar power, and maybe new power sources we haven't even invented yet. There's work being done on all kinds of other breakthroughs. But all of this is to say, there is suddenly a recognition that universities need to step up their game and be part of delivering not just big theory, but on the ground action.
Let me say that in your last sentences right there was a big message also for Argentina, where we have Vaca Muerta, which is a main shale gas reservoir, number 2 or 3 in the world, but we keep delaying the development of it. So if you don't do it at the proper timing, then you will be losing the window of opportunity probably, because everybody will be moving to the next paradigm. So
Exactly.
There's a timing for gas and for Vaca Muerta as well.
You have a 20-year window in my mind. And by the way, it takes about 20 years to pay off the cost of the infrastructure that has to be built and the investment that has to be made. So if you don't move very fast now, I think the window closes and the prospect for getting a proper payback on an investment like that could be ended. But I think as part of a transition strategy, there will continue to be a commitment to natural gas, particularly to the extent it displaces the dirtier fossil fuels over the short to middle term.
That's very interesting. And regarding a previous sentence of your last intervention about Yale and the policies, sustainable policies, it is also quite interesting to follow some of the debates for Yale and other institutions on where the endowment money is being invested. So I think that is a reflection of a change in the views of several actors that are going to have very important consequences.
Well, no, it's very interesting to see. There's a big debate broadly in the investment world, but especially at the Yale Investment Office, because David Swenson, who is our investment advisor, is one of the perceived big thought leaders about how to manage endowments broadly, how to manage investments in general. And he has been under a lot of pressure to divest from fossil fuels. And he's resisted that pressure because he says, as the endowment manager, the job is to maximize returns. So we have the maximum amount of money, which we use for things like scholarships to allow our students to attend without paying the crazy high prices that education in the United States costs. But David Swenson has also been very clever. He has said to all of the people that manage Yale's money, and as you probably know, David Swenson and his team don't actually do any of the money. They watch over 26 different money managers who are the ones responsible for the funding. And he has said to them all, I'm not asking you to divest, but I am asking you to tell me how you think about climate change as a factor, particularly a risk factor in the portfolio you've put our money into. And a number of those folks came back 6 months after that was requested a year or two ago by David Swenson and reported that they had divested some specific holdings, that they thought certain kinds of investments were more likely to be, as we now call it, carbon exposed, more likely to face risk and subpar returns. And it was the prospect of that outsized risk and subpar returns that got those certain kinds of projects taken out of these portfolios. So I do think there is a change afoot in the investment world, and Yale is very much on top of that. And I think you're going to continue to see, and in fact, you already, for anyone who owns oil stocks, it's been a better last few months, but the last couple of years, not very good. And I think you're going to see an investment public that continues to discriminate against companies that seem part of yesterday's news and in favor of energy companies that have laid out a transition strategy. That really is the agenda for all of us. What's your transition strategy to be where you want to be a decade or two or three from now, and at the front, not the back, of the new economy that's being built.
Dan, before turning to Guillermina, the president of our Yale chapter club in Argentina, I want from you to have one final comment on the following topic. If you go back to some of our exchanges and your views mainly, innovation and environment are two key vectors of the present and the future. And both of them don't fit very well in traditional economics. So innovation typically is the outcome of highly non-perfect markets, and environment typically is one of the reasons why markets are not perfect, as you were mentioning. So in both cases, traditional economic theories do not help, so to say, in order to dealing with this issue, and also to setting up maybe some of the frames for these two topics to develop, to evolve. So I don't know what you think about that. And if you look at the Nobel Prizes in economics, people like Paul Romer from Stanford University got a prize in innovation and what they call endogenous economic growth. And people like William Nordhaus from Yale got a prize, Nobel Prize in economics and climate change. But the message here and the question to you is, what do you think about the idea of countries, including Argentina, but many more, getting to a point where they have to really change the way they see the economy? Because many of the traditional approaches, they are the basis for some of the policies that have to be put in place, but they are not enough.
I think it's quite right that what we're going to see is transformation in fundamental economic theory. I think there has been too much willingness in economics to focus on the short term, not the longer term. You know, there's a big question around what is the proper discount rate to use in making judgments about things like climate change policy. And this is in part what Bill Nordhaus at Yale won the Nobel Prize for, saying that the economics field needed to be more careful and more analytically rigorous in how it takes on problems like climate change with long duration. You can't simply use a traditional discount rate, or anything that is a cost in the future has no present consequence. So I think you're seeing a change. I think you're also seeing some big picture rethinking of the fundamentals of capitalism more broadly. And that's a topic of several new books. You know, there's a book that's come out from Rebecca Henderson, who I guess I hesitate to mention, a Harvard professor here on a Yale Club event. But Rebecca Henderson at the business school has written a great book on reimagining capitalism. Mike Porter, also at the Harvard Business School, has been talking about shared value as something companies should be seeking. So I think there is change afoot in the underlying economics of our society and the underlying models of corporate success that are being put forward. And I do think at the center of the need for those new models is exactly, Pablo, what you say, that if you don't take better account of things like the environment, you will have uninternalized externalities that produce market failure. And then we can't be confident that the basic free market forces that we put so much stock in are delivering societal value. They may be delivering private corporate value, but they may not be benefiting us as a society as a whole. And I do think we're getting better at tracking this. And frankly, the ability to do what I'm calling for, which is to end externalities. And for those who are interested, that's the title of an article I have forthcoming in the NYU, New York University Law Review, Environmental Law Review, coming out next month. And the theory is that in the past, we had trouble tracking externalities. It was too administratively burdensome to hold people accountable because you couldn't tell who was causing what. Not true anymore. We now have sensors and big data tracking systems and the internet and all kinds of electronic devices that make it relatively simple and low cost to keep track of who's causing what harm and to make them pay for it. And that's why I'm quite confident this is the model that's coming within the next 5 or 10 years, a change that will be very rapid. And again, companies that are not watching, not thinking about this, are at risk of finding themselves with a business model that's out of date, that depends on, as I was saying, privatizing gains, but socializing some of these pollution and other externalities. And that will be very hard to sustain in the future.
Dan, I want to thank you for your generosity, for sharing your ideas in such an open way. And I want to get back to Guillermina to do the closing and to moderate the final comments and questions.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you, Professor Esty, again for your illuminating ideas. Here we have some questions for you. One from Juan Maldonado, who says, which role do you foresee for the natural gas production in energy transition in the U.S.?
So my answer, which I started to lay out with Pablo, is that I think natural gas is a bridge fuel. I think to the extent it displaces dirtier fuels like coal, there is a potential value for natural gas over the next several decades. And I do think in some very hard to decarbonize sectors, like shipping, for example, you may see a transition to natural gas, big ships that are moving freight across the ocean. And so I think there's quite a significant opportunity there. I do think, however, that the natural gas window of opportunity is closing, as Pablo and I were discussing. And I don't think projects that start 5 and 10 years from now will have necessarily the full time frame they need to pay off the investments required. So I would say this is an important piece of a strategy, but one that's got a time frame around it with a clock ticking that makes it less valuable every day and probably not viable within 5 or 10 years.
Thanks a lot. Then there's another question from Kyle Kagan, who is president of the Yale International Alliance. And in fact, he has 3 questions in one, which I'm going to read. Is where do you see the most resistance to sustainability campaign worldwide? That's the first one. Then related to this one, what is the root cause of these resistance? How should we address it?
So I think the big challenge for sustainability is that it is a commitment to an idea that extends the definition of success out into the future. And so the biggest challenge is for people who don't have the economic circumstances that allow them to think beyond today. So this means that people in poverty will perhaps resist the idea that investments get made today that will pay off only in the future. And certainly that was the Donald Trump agenda in the United States. He spoke to people who felt their budgets were so tight they couldn't afford to think about an issue like climate change because they could not afford to pay more for energy today. Their budgets were too crunched and their circumstances too difficult to really be able to take on board an issue where much of the payoff is out over time. And I think that's true around the world, not just Donald Trump, but there are leaders all over the world who are skeptical about climate change and skeptical about sustainability because they perceive it to be a longer term payoff and they've got shorter term priorities. And I would say this is true in a number of countries that have kind of become anti-environmental. I think Bolsonaro in Brazil represents that spirit. He wants to develop the Amazon because he's got a short-term urgent need for economic progress, particularly for some segments of that society. And I think he has gotten some support for that short-term poverty alleviation focus, even if it comes at the expense of the environment and sustainability more broadly. And I would say the same thing about Putin in Russia and Duterte in the Philippines. All of these folks have a common theme of prioritizing the short term and the immediate needs, particularly of the segment of the public that's not doing very well. So in many regards, that's the source of the resistance, as well as some people who just don't pay attention to science and are kind of unwilling to face facts. But I think the root cause is different sense of priority, a priority on the short term versus a priority on the longer term. And I think the answer of how to address it is that we need to focus in bringing along those who are economically challenged. And this is why there's a big focus now in the context of climate change and the transition to a clean energy future on what's known as a just transition. That's a big point of policy discussion and debate. And at the heart of that just transition discussion are questions of fairness and equity. And it turns out it's not a simple strategy because there's different dimensions that have to be addressed. And I'll just give you a couple of them. One, obviously the most challenge comes for people who are very poor and can't afford to pay more for anything. And these folks need to be helped toward being able to see how a clean energy future is in their interest and not against their interest. Second, there are in many societies, communities that are deeply invested in the economy of the fossil fuel status quo. In the United States, we call this the West Virginia problem, referring to our state where so much coal is mined. And if we stop mining coal and stop burning coal, West Virginia's economy will suffer. But I think one of the things the Biden administration is doing is to focus very much on the need to give West Virginia and other fossil fuel dependent parts of America a new economic future, new job possibilities, new facilities, new infrastructure that would allow them to be competitive in other categories of economic activity. And then, of course, there is a connection to rural life. Life in rural areas compared to cities is more high carbon emitting, more greenhouse gas emissions. So in America, at least, there's a big pushback from rural America against action on sustainability broadly, action on climate change in particular. So again, there's going to have to be a just transition strategy to ensure that the rural part of America doesn't feel selected out for particular burden from this transition that's coming. And I think all of this is now emerging as a very critical topic. And I suspect the same issues exist in Argentina. Those who are really facing dire economic circumstances cannot get their mind around the idea of sustainability and its longer term agenda. And they really have no patience for climate change because that's a problem for tomorrow. And they need to feed their families today. And I will tell you, my own view is that the environmentalists out across the world, in the United States, but I'm sure in Argentina as well, have been under attending to this issue of how we make sure that environmental progress does not come at the expense or the perceived expense of people with limited economic prospects. So we really do need to take on board this idea of a just transition to reduce the resistance to the sustainability campaign that's been highlighted in the question.
Okay, thanks a lot, Professor Esty. Pablo, I don't know if you want to close this talk with an idea, because I think we are getting to an end since there are no more questions. Yeah,
just for closing, I want to thank the Professor Esty, of course, for giving us all these ideas, and also in the way we were able to talk, I think, in very open fashion about very critical issues for the world, for the countries. I think it's been an hour, I guess, of exchanging ideas that have a lot to do with things that are going on and will happen in the next few months and years. And also I want to thank the Yale Club of Argentina and the Yale International Alliance for being the co-host of this event. And finally, last but not least, I want to repeat that we are very honored to have you, Professor Daniel Esty, as honorary fellow of our proud Center of Argentinian Engineering. So thank you so much. And I think with this, you can close the event. Done.
Pablo, thank you very much. Thanks again to the entire Yale Club of Argentina. It's a real pleasure to have a chance to be part of this conversation with you today. And I thank all of you who stay connected to the university and give us a dimension of international focus that is important for our students who must have that sensitivity to be good citizens, not only of our own country in the United States, but of the world. And I think Yale benefits from all of you who stay engaged and come back to visit. One of the things I would say is that the pandemic has given us a chance to do events of this kind that are more virtual than we might have done in the past. So I'm pleased that I can suddenly be with you all from many thousands of kilometers away. But I do hope that there will be an opportunity in the years ahead for face-to-face contact. I don't think that a virtual call of this kind can fully substitute for a chance to be together and perhaps enjoy some nice Argentine wine over a beautiful steak. And so I look forward to the chance to visit Buenos Aires, if not in the coming months when we're still in a bit of a struggle, but in the coming couple of years. So thank you all very much. Really a pleasure to be with you. And I do look forward to continuing the conversation. And I very much hope live at some point soon.
Okay, we will have a chapter 2. We will let you know, right? Thanks a lot, Professor Esty. Thanks, Pablo, and thanks to Veronica, Luimar, and everyone that made this talk possible.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Muchas gracias.